Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the bunker. It's been a bit of time since we have spoken last. On my last episode, we spoke about we spoke about Roswell, something I swore I would never go on the air and talk about. I felt that people like Stan Friedman had already pretty much did all the heavy lifting, and there was really nothing else left to go on, but I was wrong about that. And, as this journey has been a sort of self-discovery and a humbling experience after humbling experience, I'm going to, on this episode, tackle something that I, again, was interested in, have heard about, had my own feelings about, but honestly never took very, very seriously. And I mean, maybe to my discredit, you can definitely make that point. But I'm a paranormal guy. I started out as a paranormal investigator, being trained by other paranormal investigators and dealing with quote unquote hauntings and helping individuals and people in their homes and businesses deal with paranormal activity, which up until fairly recently I thought was nothing more than just hauntings, a poltergeist, an angry spirit, maybe sometimes even something negative, an elemental, things like that. But my whole point of breaking into the Fortean community and tackling high strangeness as a whole, casting a much wider net on the topic, means that I have to break into the UFO subject, which I've been interested in since I was a child, but I never really officially sort of really looked into things and investigated cases until fairly recently. One of the aspects of the UFO phenomena that I'd heard about, was interested in, is part of the phenomenon for sure. I've not had any experience myself or anyone that I know with this particular part of the phenomena, but that is the abduction experience. And, we all find our way to this topic in different ways and at a different pace. Some of us are thrown into it. Some of us are, have terrifying experiences or very profound experiences, positive or negative, as very young children. Some of us come along later. But I came across this case recently that just literally blew me away. And the place that I found this case, never heard of it before, although I've heard of many other abduction cases, Betty and Barney Hill being probably the most famous one. But there is an abduction case that took place not all that long ago, much more recent than the Betty and Barney Hill case, for sure. It took place in Australia. And I came across this case while watching one of my favorite programs on YouTube, and that would be UFO Classified, hosted by Erica Lukes and Scott Brown, who's the program I enjoy very much. Again, discovered that fairly recently, within the last 6 to 8 months or so. They were talking to Australian investigator, Bill Chalker, and his case that took place in Australia pertaining to a gentleman named Peter Khoury. This gentleman, Peter Khoury, he was born in Lebanon in 1964. He emigrated to Australia in 1973. But like many other abduction cases and individuals who are plagued by this phenomenon, there isn't just one incident. There's a string of incidents that take place, and sometimes through just sort of either through dreams or revelation or hypnotic regression, people realize, oh my God. Once they wake up to the phenomenon, they realize, oh my God, this has been happening for a long time. And this is sort of how it unfolded for Peter. when he had his most profound experience, which we'll talk about in a little bit, which is mind-blowing. It brought back memories of his first experience, at least the first that he could remember. It took place while still living in Lebanon, back in 1971. He was out in the neighborhood. He was playing with some of his cousins and some friends in the neighborhood. And they had a habit of playing on this local rooftop. And there was like this stairway they could walk up, and they would go through this big fire door and go onto this rooftop. And they would like to, it was like this like safe, secure little area where they could go off by themselves and just be kids and play. And so they would often go up there to play. And one small detail that sort of jumped out at me that, you may gloss over in the telling of the story is that all the kids are in the neighborhood. They say, let's go to the rooftop. They go up to the rooftop, and they go one by one up the stairway and through this big, heavy, sort of external, like a fire door that leads to the actual rooftop. It's thresholded out, and you have to kind of step over through the doorway. And also the doorway is spring loaded because it needs to remain closed because it's an external, fire door. And so the kids, by habit, because they had played up here so many times, just knew instinctively that each person that went up through this door would need to push that door open, step over the threshold, and onto the rooftop. And each kid, no matter how closely packed they're together, they're running up the stairs, each kid would have to push that door open and step over the threshold and onto the roof. And it was just a habit by this point. They just knew instinctively to do this. On this particular occasion, Peter happened to be the last kid to make it to the rooftop, right? And so each kid's going up, and they're pushing the door open and stepping through and going onto the roof. Something strange Peter noticed right away before he even reached the rooftop was that he saw several children ahead of him in line pass through this doorway without having to push it open. He felt this was strange, but he still instinctively just kind of held his hands up because he was expecting this door to come snapping back at him. So he was ready, and he had his hands up. As it was his turn to step through the doorway. He steps through the doorway. The door remains open, doesn't swing shut. There's no child holding the door. Like at this point, maybe, it's just stuck or something like that. That's a small detail, but what happened next kind of adds more weight to the fact that this door just remains stuck open. Because once Peter stepped through that threshold and onto that rooftop, he noticed that every other kid, all his friends and his cousins, everyone, was completely frozen. They were not moving. They were standing utterly still. And Peter's first thought at this point was, this is the game we're playing. I'm the butt of the joke. I'm the last one to come up on the roof, so I'm it, right? So he's walking around looking at his friends and his cousins, and they're not moving. And he's looking at their eyes, and they're not giving away. They're not smirking. They're not looking, giving him a side eye, like, hey, does he notice? He's not seeing any movement at all. He thinks this is still a joke. He goes up and he begins tickling some of them, like, I'm gonna get a reaction out of them. Begins tickling some of them, and there's no reaction. They're frozen. So we thought this was odd. He goes over to one of the older kids that were in the group from the neighborhood. This kid that was older than him and a little taller than he. He goes over to this kid and goes up to like tickle him under the neck, and he's like, he's got it in his mind, like, I'm gonna get him. I'm gonna get him. I'm gonna get him to laugh or chuckle or whatever and break this game we're playing here. So he goes over and he starts tickling this kid in the neck, but in so doing, he kind of looked up. He needed to look up to this kid to tickle his neck because this kid was much taller than he was. And in so doing, he notices in the sky above this rooftop is this egg-shaped craft of some kind. It's just floating there. He said it was about the size of a Volkswagen, and he could see some sort of a screen or a shield on the front of the egg It was somewhat tinted, but he could see into it, and he could observe two figures inside on the other side of this little screen. And he's observing these two figures inside. He could see, or he couldn't hear them, obviously, because they're inside this craft of whatever makeup it was. But he could see the figures in there, and he could see them turning towards each other, looking towards each other, presumably speaking to one another, and then looking back to the rooftop where the kids were. And this craft is floating there. It's floating completely silent. It's not a helicopter. It's not a drone. It's not making any sound of any kind. He can't observe any sort of propulsion. There's no propeller. There's no jet engine. There's no jet wash. There's nothing to explain how this object is floating there. And he expressed in this interview that he had, being in Lebanon, he saw many Israeli helicopters fly overhead and aircraft and all that kind of stuff, dropping propaganda papers, and his friends would run around picking up the papers because they were multicolored, and they didn't read the propaganda on it, obviously, but they would just, would make a game out of grabbing the colored papers and who could get the most of this or that or whatever. So they had observed these helicopters flying overhead repeatedly. So they were used to seeing that. And he said this was not anything like that. That this object floated above the rooftop, and it floated back and forth. And he thought at one point it came down so low that he thought, wow, this thing's going to land. And then suddenly, the next thing he knew, he and all of his friends and cousins were all on the first floor. In a flash, in the blink of an eye, suddenly he and everyone else that was on the rooftop is now on the first floor, seemingly in an instant. And he's looking around to everyone, and they're all, all his friends and family, are all unfrozen at this point, are all looking at each other and confused as how they got downstairs. We were just on the rooftop. What happened? How did we get down here? None of his friends or family, however, seemed to notice this craft and did not mention the craft. Peter thought this was significant and felt that he was the only one that had observed this thing, and so he felt uncomfortable sharing that portion of the story, so he kept it to himself. Shortly after everyone comes to and they're coming, getting their wits about them on the ground floor, they hear their parents screaming their names from down the street. And sound quite frantic from his description. One of the children who were next to the doorway of the building they're in, he went over for the doorway and waved to the parents, "Hey, we're over here, we're here," to get their parents' attention. The parents at that point come running over, and everyone observes the parents are completely freaking out, totally upset, and asking the children where they were this whole time. And, the kids were all in agreement. Like, we were just up on the rooftop. We were just playing up there. And the parents didn't believe them. And basically said to the effect, like, there's no way you could have been up there. You would have heard us. We've been calling for you. You've been gone for hours. Which confused the matter because, like I had said, the kids were all frozen on the rooftop, and then only an instant had passed, and all of a sudden they were on the first floor. Well, apparently hours had gone by, and their parents were searching everywhere in the neighborhood for them and were frantic about it. The kids were all punished because they thought, the parents thought, obviously, that they were not telling the truth and that they were hiding from them. And this was a not entirely safe neighborhood. And of course, the parents are, being a parent myself, I can relate to this, were completely upset, thinking their kids were in danger or were kidnapped or something like that. God forbid. So the kids were punished and but this whole time Peter kept this portion of the story about this craft to himself because no one else mentioned seeing this craft. And so he kept this story for obvious reasons to himself. Okay, so let's fast forward from 1971-72 area in Australia to 1988. Peter, by this point, was dating his high school sweetheart, and they were sitting outside, leaning against their car, just looking at the sky. They were discussing taking a trip to Queensland. And Peter observed this bright white light in the sky. He described traveling at, a good distance across the sky and then suddenly just stops on a dime, which will rule out, a satellite or anything like that. This is years later. He has, by this point, forgotten about his childhood incident, right? So he starts observing this object and becomes enthralled by it. And he actually even reached into the car and grabbed, like either a magazine or a newspaper or something like that, and just like rolls it up into like a tube so he can like look through it and really concentrate on this object. He begins observing this object. It shoots a solid white beam of light a short distance across the sky. He said also, this may be significant, it may not be, I'm not sure, but that this object stopped over the Southern Cross constellation. This may mean something to some of you, it may not, I'm not sure, but he pointed it out, so I'm just passing along the news. So this object shoots out a beam of light, which looks like solid. And at the end of the beam of light, looks like another orb of light appears at the end of this beam of light. And then the original orb of light disappears, and then this beam of light kind of shoots to the second location, and then the orb of light appears there. And he said he observed this object do this multiple times, bouncing around, shooting a beam, disappearing here, appearing there, and just going back, in almost like a geometric sort of search pattern across the sky. He watched this object do this for a short time, and then it just suddenly shot straight up at great speed and was quickly out of sight. It's important to note, too, that at this point, and even as a child, Peter had no foreknowledge of UFOs or abduction experiences, was not following the topic, was not knowledgeable of it at all. He was just witnessing strange things and had no sort of frame of reference for it. And it's important to point out, because I know a lot of skeptics will say, oh, well, he's reading UFO books, and so if he sees something strange in the sky, he's going to automatically associate it with UFOs. Not so in this case, because eventually Peter comes around to the UFO phenomenon and to abduction experiences. Years and years down the road, he does come to that point. But he was witnessing really, really bizarre things years before this. So he had no foreknowledge of this phenomenon to refer to. Again, he does not put two and two together. He does not think that this strange light he sees in the sky has anything to do with his, episode as a child. And again, has no frame of reference for this. About 6 months goes by. Peter moves back home with his family after being out on his own for a few years. This is bizarre. So he's chilling out at his house with his father and his brother. And Peter is actually in the living room with his father, and they're watching television. Peter's brother is in Peter's bedroom, presumably sleeping. Peter's brother comes out of the bedroom and asks Peter, like, hey, could you go sleep in the bedroom, because I want to come sleep out here. And Peter agreed, not thinking this was strange in any way. So Peter's brother comes out into the living room, crashes on, I presume, the couch. Peter goes back into his room, turns on the television, and says, I'm going to continue watching this movie, whatever it was they were watching. I'll continue watching that in here. And this was about 11:15 p.m. Peter laid down on his bed, and like I said, turned on the television, and just began to lean backwards and put his hands behind his head in a relaxed sort of posture. And the instant that his head hit his pillow, he instantly, before he even had a chance to fall asleep, this was instantaneous. He had just lain down, his head just hits his pillow. He feels this sensation of something grabbing his ankle. And he described it as being either like a thumb and forefinger, grabbing around his ankle, or some kind of device that would resemble that. Maybe a clamp or something like that. But he described it as a thumb and forefinger. That's what it felt like, grabbing him on his ankle. And the instant that he felt this, whatever it was, grabbing his ankle, he felt this tingling and pins and needles traveling up his leg. And he soon realizes he's completely paralyzed. He cannot move. Presumably he realizes this when he, tries to shoot up and say, what the heck, and look at his leg to see what's going on. He can't move. The only thing he can move are his eyes, though. He can move his eyes, but he can move nothing else. And he begins to panic because this is, this would be alarming to anyone. I mean, you've heard the episodes of sleep paralysis described by people. That's not what this was, because he had not had a chance to fall asleep yet. That aside, just thinking about the sensation of becoming instantly paralyzed and not able to defend yourself is terrifying. And it was especially terrifying for Peter, who was a sizable individual, a large, strong man, worked in construction, practiced multiple martial arts, was someone who could handle himself. Suddenly here he's helpless. He can't move. So he was terrified. But like I said, he could move his eyes. And so he looks, down towards the foot of his bed, just with his eyes, and he witnesses some sort of short being, about approximately 4 feet tall, that had sort of dark blue skin, which was wearing some kind of cloak that obscured its form and shape and face for the most part, but apparently at one point it turned towards him, and he could see that it looked like almost gorilla-like, but blue. Once he saw this being, he, his fear level ramped up, obviously. He thought that, this thing's paralyzing him, it's here to do him harm, this thing's evil. And so he was, his anxiety level at this point is shooting through the roof, as you could imagine. He then sees other figures. There's multiple of these little figures around his bed. And now he's really terrified. He's outnumbered. He's paralyzed. He can't defend himself. And these things are here to do him harm. So he's terrified at this point. So he sees a total of 3 of these little figures. But then, as his fear level is rising and rising and rising, he then notices movement. And this is on the right side of his bed. Then he notices movement to the left side of his bed. He looks to the left side of his bed and he sees 2 more figures. These, however, are slightly taller than the other ones. They have, they have large black eyes. They were wearing some sort of what he described as like surgical masks on their face. He notices these figures, like I said, were much taller than these gorilla-looking figures to the right of the bed. The 2 figures, he got a sense somehow. He's not able to describe how he was able to discern this, but he felt that one of these figures was male and the other was female. And he observed that the female of the 2 taller figures was wearing the surgical mask, which was very, very thin because they had very small mouths, was over her mouth, and the male figure of the taller beings had its little mask pulled down under its chin, so he could see the male's mouth, and it was this little slit of a mouth, really small nose, large black eyes. Peter described when he saw the cover of Whitley Strieber's book, Communion, he was dumbfounded because he said that is exactly what those figures looked like, the taller ones. But when he observed these figures and he looked into their eyes, he felt this strange calmness come over him. Where just a moment before he was terrified, thinking he was going to die. These things are evil. They're here to do him harm, kill him, whatever. God knows what, tear him apart. He didn't know. He was just overwhelmed by anxiety and fear. Suddenly he sees these taller figures and he's instantly calmed. instantly calmed, unexplainably calm. He receives a message in his mind that seems to come directly from these taller beings and directly to his mind. And they say, please be calm. We're not here to harm you. Everything will be okay. It'll be like last time. And this impression sort of perturbed him because he thought, wait, last time? What do you mean last time? He doesn't remember this ever taking place. And here they're referring to last time, implying that this has happened at least once before, which he has no memory of. So that was kind of alarming, for obvious reasons. So then at this point, the male of the two taller figures pulls out this some kind of strange device, holding it in his big 3-fingered hand. And Peter described it as looking like a syringe, but it was long, and it had this, almost like he said it looked like a fiber optic sort of light coming out of the end of it. And this figure approached Peter and pointed this device at the, somewhere around the back of his head. Again, Peter couldn't move. He could just kind of move his eyes. This figure pointed this device at the back of his head, at which point Peter blacked out. Once he becomes conscious again, feels like maybe 15 minutes had gone by, maybe 20 minutes had gone by, right? He awakens from being blacked out and suddenly just shoots off of his bed, all this pent-up energy and anxiety and the ability, the inability to move suddenly lifted. He pops out of his bed, like a shot, is looking around his room. He doesn't see the short figures. He doesn't see the tall figures. He doesn't see anyone. And then his mind goes to, oh my God, my father and brother are out in the living room. So he goes out into the living room and he sees that they're both seemingly sound asleep. And he runs over to his father and tries to wake him. He starts calling his name and shaking him, pushing him, grabbing his shoulders. And he's not waking up. Peter describes that he began to fear that his father was dead. I mean, he seemed like he was dead. He was just completely unconscious and not asleep, obviously, because shaking him and calling his name loudly would have woken him up if he were just simply asleep. But he wasn't waking up. And becoming more and more fearful, Peter turned to his brother and started shaking him, trying to wake him up. He also would not wake up. So now, completely overcome with fear, oh my God, are they both dead? What happened? What did these things do to them? He began slapping his brother, and after several hard slaps to the face, his brother finally woke up and described this feeling of being just switched off. Like he was awake one minute, totally unconscious the next, no idea what had happened. So he and his brother work together, and they wake up their father finally, to their great relief. And Peter asks his brother, how long was I in my bedroom? How long were we out? And his brother said, I don't know, about 15 minutes. And, this temporarily put Peter at ease because he that's what he had thought. It'd be about 15 minutes, 20 minutes. Then they realized that the movie that had been playing on the television set had gone off. And the end of day broadcast, which was, the national anthem and the flag blowing, was playing on the television set. Now, for younger listeners out there, you may not remember this because now TV is just 24 hours a day now at this point. But when we were kids, the television was just a couple of networks. There wasn't cable. None of that stuff existed yet. And at the end of the broadcast day, there would be the national anthem would play, and then the TV would turn off. They would just be static snow. That's it. They would stop broadcasting, and that's it. And they realized that this is what was taking place, which would suggest that hours had gone by. Remember, like I said, when this episode began, it was 11:15. It's about 2:30 in the morning when the broadcast would end, and then the anthem would come on and the TV would shut off. So, at least 2 to 2.5 hours had elapsed. And again, no one knows what took place because they have no memory of that many hours passing by. To them, it seemed just a few minutes. And this is a consistent thing with abduction cases. Missing time. We've all heard of it. I have to say it's strange. It's unnerving. It's I used to be a heavy partier back in the day, and I would sometimes consume enough alcohol to quote unquote black out. And I would have to say that, for those of you who have had that experience, it's rather unnerving to hear stories from other people like, oh my God, wow, you were so funny last night. And then you're thinking back and you're going, yeah, what the hell did I do? Like, what did I say? Because you don't have any memory of it. That's missing time. Peter wasn't drunk. He was not under the influence of any drugs. And I can't imagine being in that situation. For some people that consistently experience this missing time phenomena, I can't imagine the anxiety that must cause, because you've got hours and hours and hours consistently passing by without any knowledge of what took place. And this is what Peter experienced. And one other significant series of events leading up to this particular event that I thought was significant was what Peter described as, a few weeks before this event took place. He and his brother, both, at least, maybe more of the family, witnessed a strange phenomena that would fall into the more sort of paranormal haunting realm. But I found it very significant that this took place in this particular case. Peter and his brother would hear what sounded like boots, like heavy booted footsteps marching up their driveway. And the way he describes how their yard is laid out, the driveway comes, from the street up to their garage, and then the garage is kind of surrounded by trees and fence and stuff. And there's really, if there were what sounded like to them multiple people, many people, maybe a squad or a platoon of soldiers, for example, marching up their driveway. If that were the case and that were actually what was taking place, there's nowhere for them to go. So if you had heard that, which they did on several occasions, and they would, like Peter would look out his window and his brother would go out the door and kind of look around, and they would try to observe this from multiple different vantage points, and they were never able to see anything, but they would hear these loud marching footsteps coming up their driveway. But they were never able to see or couple any physical event to these sounds. I've experienced this kind of thing in the paranormal realm. I mean, so many times I've lost count. Just things that happen like that don't make sense. Sounds, screams, voices coming out of thin air that should account. There should be a person to assign to that, or a group of people to explain the sounds you're hearing. But there is none. And I thought this was significant. When I was just an infant, my sisters were chased by a UFO down our street into our yard. A UFO flew over the house and out into the field, into this farm that was behind the house. We also experienced poltergeist activity in the home. So these things, and you've all heard probably the stories of Skinwalker. That they're seeing orbs and UFOs and hearing figures, hearing voices, like all that. It's all inextricably linked somehow, and it's certainly so in Peter's case. The next day that Peter experienced this strange sort of abduction, quote unquote, experience of missing time. It was the following day he found a strange, like, kind of burn mark on his shin. It looked like it was almost like a cigarette burn / scoop mark in his shin that he described to Vivian, his high school sweetheart, which was his eventually his wife. Described this burn mark that looked substantial at one point of the day, and then just a few hours later he went to actually show her when he physically saw her again, and this thing was almost completely healed, which was odd. He also found a spot in the back of his head where there was like a little dimple, and there was a spot of dried blood, which proves that something physically touched his head where he witnessed this being touching his head with some kind of device. There was physical proof of it. The physical proof in this case is going to go a long way. And the physical proof that he ended up with at the end of this case is going to blow your mind. This is just the start of it. His significant other, Vivian, suggested to him at this point, maybe you should go to a doctor and, and get checked out, just to make sure you're okay. Because of what's taking place, who knows who these people were, what they did to you. His wife has been extremely supportive throughout this thing. Where some may not be. She's always been strong and been supportive and been by his side, which is awesome. So he takes her advice. He goes to his doctor that he had been seeing for about 10 years. Very, trusted this person very much. And he goes to his doctor and he spills the beans. He opens up completely. He tells her everything that had happened. The beings, the device, the everything. He told her everything because he trusted this person. And his doctor's reaction was, probably a reaction that many of you face when you share these kind of stories of these experiences. She laughed at him. She laughed at him like it was the funniest thing that she had ever heard. And he admonished her for this on the spot and said, I trusted you. I find your reaction to this unacceptable. This is the truth. This is what happened. And, he made a decision at that point to cut ties with that doctor, and he never went back to see that doctor again. And I don't blame him. He opened up, he trusted her with this information that was, I'm sure, extremely difficult to share. And, he got the reaction that many of you get when you talk about this stuff. Good for Peter for putting his foot down and standing up for himself and cutting ties with that doctor. Because he knew at that point, after then, he was not able to trust her anymore. Because he shared super intimate details about his life and these experiences, and she thought it was a joke and thought it was funny. That's terrible. That's terrible. That's what a lot of people get when they talk about this kind of thing. And, that seems to be changing as of late in the last few years. And hopefully it continues to change and go more further in this direction. But we'll see. So at this point, Peter is, he's seeking help. And again, it's important to note, and something that jumped out at me at this portion of the story, is that he didn't go right to MUFON. He didn't go right to a UFO group. He didn't go right to, any person of questionable sort of background to get help. He went from doctor to doctor, to psychologist, the counselor, psychiatrist. He was really trying to discover, was this actually happening to him? Was this really taking place? Was this some kind of breakdown? Like he was looking for answers. He knew what he experienced, but he wasn't stamping any kind of label on it yet. He was really just out there looking for answers anywhere he could find it. And he found that over and over again when he was, going to this counselor, this psychiatrist, and that psychologist, he found over and over again when he began to describe his experiences, and when he would get to the part of the story where he felt presences in his room, or beings in his room, it was at that point that every one of these people said, oh, I'm sorry, we don't handle that. It left him to continue looking for answers. I found that interesting too. But so one day, Peter he finds this counselor that is in Sydney that listens to his story and finally gives him some good quality advice and says that, I think that your story sounds very similar to a lot of other people that are experiencing alien abductions, which this blew Peter away because still at this point, he wasn't equating this with aliens. He was describing what he experienced subjectively in the moment, but wasn't labeling it aliens or demons or whatever. I mean, he's just going by what he's looking and seeing and what he was feeling. I thought that was significant. But so this counselor says, I think this is the alien abduction phenomenon. There's a group forming in Sydney, and in a few weeks they're going to have their first meeting. I think you should probably check it out. They probably have some information that you could probably take something good away from this. So he takes this advice and he attends this meeting. He hears other people's stories about other abductions, and he realizes like, oh my God, like I'm not alone. This is happening to a lot of other people. And so at this point, he just goes on a rampage and just buying every UFO book about abductions and sightings and experiences that he could get his hands on. And he has a pretty impressive and substantial library at this point. And because he was obsessed. He had a direction to go. This phenomenon is happening to other people, and this is what it is. And so he just read book after book after book, trying to find answers for himself, which I'm sure we can all relate to. The events that took place next are so hard to believe. It's I've read this story multiple times. I'm reading Bill Chalker's book right now. The events that took place next are just earth-shattering, unbelievable. I totally believe them, but I wouldn't blame anyone who doesn't believe it, because it is absolutely unbelievable what took place next. So what we're going to do now at this point, we're going to take a little break, and then we're going to come back, and then I'm going to blow your minds with what took place in Peter's case next. So we'll be right back right after this. Okay, welcome back, everybody. So we're going to pick up Peter's story. We're going to fast forward just a few years into the early 90s. When, as I'd mentioned earlier, Peter was worked in the construction field. And in the early 90s, he had a horrible experience with several people who tried to steal some equipment and tools from a job site he was working on. And he happened upon them and attempted to fight these individuals off. And he ended up getting stabbed in the chest. He got cut with a broken bottle. He got hit over the head with a shovel. Still managed to fight these people off, but suffered some pretty horrible injuries. A cracked skull being among them, cuts and lacerations, a stabbing wound. So long story short, he obviously had taken a leave of absence from work to recover and heal. And it was during this time that his most profound experience took place, at least the most profound one he could recall, which will make sense in a moment. So it's 1992. He's home recovering from his injuries. So Peter is taking time off from work and just staying at home and healing. And he drives his wife at this time, Vivian, to the bus station or train station. I forget which. But just driving her to the station to drop her off so she could, take public transit to work. And so, this particular day, Peter's driving his wife to work, and he found that the further he got away from home, the more sick he became. And he talks about this drive as if it's just not very far at all to the station, a 2 to 3 minute drive. And he describes having to pull over like 8 to 10 times to just open up the door and throw up. He was getting very ill, and he found the further away from home he got, the more sick he became. Very strange. Vivian, I guess at this point, had become kind of, used to him being ill and stuff with all his injuries and everything. Just took it in stride. But so he drops Vivian off at the station and begins to drive home. Again, he's periodically getting ill, having to pull over and throw up. But he found that the closer he got back home, the better and better he felt, and the less and less sick he got. Kind of odd. But so by this point, he's worn out. He's already, he's got probably a bad headache at this point. He's weak. He's, already recovering from these horrible injuries, repeatedly getting sick. So the only thing he could think of when he got home after all this was just jumping in bed and just going to sleep and just sleeping it off, which he did. So he just got home, shut and locked the door, went right to bed and pulled the covers over his head and just tried to just go right to sleep. And then, he's not sure about how much time had passed, he feels something or someone sit on his bed. He feels like that the pressing down, the depression on the mattress, and you can hear the sound of the mattress. And his first thought is like, oh my God, did it let like a neighborhood animal follow me into the house and jump on the bed? Is like a neighborhood dog follow me inside? I didn't realize, and it's now jumping on the bed. So he pulls the covers off of his head, begins to sit up, and he at this point he observes two women in his room. There's one, a blonde woman that is on his bed, on top of him, straddling him. And there's another woman who looks what he described as Asian. It's sort of like sitting at the foot of the bed, just like sitting there kind of watching. And he tries to sit up, and he describes something very strange at this point. Stranger than, sitting up in your bed and finding two strange naked women in your room. They're naked too, by the way. And so he begins to sit up, but he realizes that as he starts to sit up, it's almost like his body became split in two. And he was physically seeing a wispy outline of himself in front of himself. And he could see this strange naked woman through the image of himself, almost as if he were split in two, like his astral body became separated from his physical body for just a second. And he could see it. He could see his own astral body and see this woman through it, through the image. But then as he physically sat up, he sort of caught up to his quote-unquote astral body, or his spirit, whatever that was, and then he became whole again. At which point, this woman who's on his bed, the blonde woman straddling him, grabs him behind the head and begins to pull him into her breast. And Peter obviously resists. He doesn't know who these people are. Well, he doesn't know what's going on. So he tries to fight back and actually push this strange woman away. And he finds that her strength is so intense that he's not able to fight her off. She pulls him into her left breast and just pulls him into there. And he is finding it at this point difficult to breathe. Like he describes himself as being, very susceptible to claustrophobia. And so he starts to panic because he can't breathe. And this individual who is much stronger than him, seemingly, is preventing him from breathing. She's just pulling him into herself. And he can't breathe. So he starts to panic. The only thing he can think to do is bite down. So he bites down into this woman's breast. And at which point, she doesn't yell out, doesn't scream, doesn't express any sort of emotion or reaction at all. She just lets go. And then he's able to, push her away. And then there's just this kind of look of confusion on the woman's face. And he, at this point, sort of senses this communication between the two women. Again, telepathic seemingly, because no words were physically spoken, but he was just sort of following also maybe their body language and their facial expressions, but he was picking up on the impression that they were saying that, oh, he's done something wrong. This isn't what's supposed to happen. This isn't what happened last time. There's that phrase again. What happened last time? What last time? He's thinking. Meanwhile, as he bit down on this woman's breast, he felt something in his mouth. Was it a piece of her skin? A piece of her nipple? Like he doesn't really know. He just felt something in his mouth that sort of felt like it went into the back of his throat. And when this took place, it began to burn, like he had swallowed acid. And he began coughing uncontrollably, trying to dislodge this piece of debris, whatever it was, in his throat. But he was unable to do so, and he was coughing and coughing and coughing and coughing. At one point, he sort of bends over in this fit of coughing in a last-ditch effort to try to dislodge this object, whatever it was, in his throat that's burning and burning and burning. And when he sits back up, the women are gone. But he's still coughing. He still feels the burning. He still feels something in his throat. So, completely freaked out at this point, not knowing where these people came from, where they went. He doesn't know what's in his throat. It feels like he swallowed acid. It's burning. He can't stop coughing. He goes into the kitchen. He grabs some bread, starts eating some bread in an effort to kind of dislodge this object in his throat. He starts chugging water, trying to wash it down. Nothing seemed to help. He keeps drinking water and eating bread. So I think at this point, the coughing fit sort of calmed down a little bit. He, at this point, needs to go to the bathroom. So he goes into the bathroom, to relieve himself. But when he starts urinating, his penis now begins burning horribly. Like he described it, slashed with razors, he said. And this gets a bit more graphic in the book than it did in the interview, for obvious reasons. But he found that because he's looking at himself, checking himself out, because he can't figure out why he's in such pain downstairs, right? And so he looks down at his penis, and he sees a couple of hairs that are sort of wrapped around wrapped around his penis under his foreskin. And so he very painfully, he describes getting these things off. He takes these hairs off of himself, and he finds a plastic bag, and thank goodness he did this, thinking on his toes at this point. And he takes the hairs and he puts them in the bag. He labels it, real quickly, and sticks it in a filing cabinet. And now, again, thank goodness he did this, because this is incredible. So in his search for answers about the things he was going through, and all these strange experiences that he was, going through at this point, he's thinking back to that incident in the 70s in Lebanon. Could this be connected? Did something happen there? Is this that last time they're referring to? The questions are going through his mind. He becomes connected to the investigator, Bill Chalker, who has been investigating UFOs since the 60s. I mean, he's super knowledgeable, and is an amazing investigator. And I'm reading his book now. It's phenomenal. Again, Peter keeps this story about the hairs and this incident with the women to himself. Several weeks goes by, actually, before he even is comfortable enough to share it with Vivian, which he eventually does. And again, she's super supportive, because just knowing the other weird things he's gone through in his life, she didn't, I don't want to say expected it, but was still there for him and still supported him. And so 7 more years goes by before Peter shares the story of, these hairs and this evidence with Bill, which thank God he eventually did. He eventually turned over those hairs to Bill, who had contacts in the quote-unquote Invisible College. And for those of you who don't know, the Invisible College was a group of scientists who were secretly investigating and using science to investigate the UFO phenomenon, the abduction phenomenon, but were doing so on the down low in order to protect their careers and their reputations, because this is, like I'd mentioned before, this is, considered pseudoscience. This is laughed about in most scientific circles, which it shouldn't be, but it is what it is. And so, once Peter turned these hairs over to Bill turned them over to the, quote, Invisible College So Bill Chalker took the hair sample from Peter, handed it over to his contact in the quote-unquote invisible college, Dr. Horace Drew, who oversaw the DNA testing that was performed on the hairs. Now, before I learned of this case, I didn't think that there was any substantial physical evidence of an abduction. I mean, we've heard of trace evidence of UFO landings, like at Rendlesham Forest or at Socorro. And even in the case right over here, the Stonehenge incidents, where there was physical evidence that something had landed, right? But before this case, I didn't think that there was any case of physical evidence of an actual abduction or physical evidence of an alien visitation, I'll put it that way. But Peter's case changed everything. Dr. Horace Drew undergoes, full DNA profiling of these hairs that were found. And the results were quite staggering. Okay, so what I'd like to do now is actually read right from Bill Chalker's book, Hair of the Alien, DNA and Other Forensic Evidence of Alien Abduction. This book, Dan, I'm still digging through this thing, and it's phenomenal. And in reference to this DNA testing, I wanted to, and I'm glad he went into great detail on this part of the case, because I was super curious about how exactly this hair was tested, how reliable was the test, what sort of testing was applied, is this normal testing that is done in other circles, how does all this work? Because this is super important. There was trace evidence left by, quote-unquote, aliens. And, the reliability of the testing, as Bill puts it succinctly in this book, is paramount to proving that this phenomenon is actually taking place. And so I just want to read straight from his book here, because this is awesome stuff. And he says the biochemists undertook a standard forensic investigation of the shed hair over several months from late 1998 to early 1999. The method they chose, after considerable discussion and evaluation, was based on forensic procedures established by the Federal Bureau of Investigation for the accurate analysis of biochemical evidence found at crime scenes. The method was designed to produce a precise DNA sequence to see how it compares with the normal human DNA variations. Research had shown that for forensic purposes, the greatest apparent DNA variability in humans is found in the region of DNA called mitochondrial hypervariable region 1. Mitochondrial DNA is present in any cell in quantities of 200 to 500 times that of nuclear DNA, and hence is more easily detected in an aged sample. It has the further advantages of uniquely preserving the female DNA and being more resistant to deterioration than nuclear DNA. Thus, it is more likely to be recovered at crime scenes, and in our particular situation, our quote-unquote suspects were female, albeit of a most unusual kind. So, he's lending super heavy credibility to the techniques that were used, and honestly, they're used by police and the FBI for identifying remains and for catching criminals. And so this is as legit as it gets, folks. I mean, it literally doesn't get any more legit than this. This is what they use to identify these hairs. Bill goes on. The hair samples were prepared in the prescribed way for forensic DNA work, which involved an elaborate quote-unquote chemical washing to ensure that the surface of the hairs was not contaminated in any way. No DNA was recovered from the washing step. Following a prolonged extraction step at elevated temperatures, fragmentation of the hair into smaller pieces, and repeated boiling and freezing with dry ice, the DNA from each was released from its protein structure, purified, and prepared for the PCR amplification step. The PCR step, in simple terms, creates a very large quantity of the original extracted DNA, making it possible to analyze the DNA in more detail. Without that critical step of amplification and copying, there would not be enough DNA to examine. Again, he's just giving more and more credibility to the procedure that was used in the DNA sequencing of this hair that was found as a result of this bizarre visitation that Peter had to go through. The results are mind-boggling. I just have to say. Absolutely mind-boggling. So when the scientists, did this DNA profile on this blonde hair that was recovered from this fair-skinned woman that was on Peter's bed, they would probably expect to find, the DNA of a Scandinavian individual, Northern European. But that's not what they found. What they found in this blonde hair was a rare Asian Mongoloid DNA type, which on its face right away states that the hair should have been black and not white or blonde, which it was, and it was not dyed. Just the visual inspection of the hair, the scientists and Bill and everyone admitted that the hair looked strange, almost like it was clear, much finer than human hair, and it should not have been blonde. And another thing they found, which was mind-boggling, was that when they tested the shaft of the hair, they also tested the root of the hair. And the root and shaft of the same hair had different profiles, which shouldn't be even physically possible. They ruled out any possible chance of laboratory contamination. They secured actually some of Peter's hair and some of Vivian's hair as well to use as a control group, and it did not match either of those. And once you look at the hairs and realize that the shaft and the root of the hair have completely different DNA profiles, that's not normal. That's not something that you find in humans. And so what were their conclusions? Well, they also discovered that when running CCR5 testing, they discovered that whoever this individual was also basically immune to many viruses, and like AIDS, for example, which is completely strange. And coupling that with the different DNA profiles in different parts of the same hair, the scientists came to the conclusion that this is the result of some sort of advanced, DNA manipulation, maybe even some kind of cloning. They weren't totally sure. They couldn't say for sure, but the findings were extremely unusual and should not be physically possible. And, this to me really blew my mind because this to me kind of blows the lid off of any skeptic that or debunker that wants to say that this is definitely not happening, there's no way this is real, blah, 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 blah. Because in this case, there's proof. And, and Bill's book is fantastic, and it even includes some photographs and stuff. And, the DNA sequencing is right in there. Everything's in there. And here's this is evidence. Now, can we say they're aliens? Well, no. But they were extremely strange individuals that somehow appeared in Peter's home without breaking and entering, without leaving a trace, that just appeared naked in his room, that have extremely unusual DNA profiles that shouldn't be possible, and then in an instant disappeared, also without a trace. You couple that with all the other strange experiences that Peter has been having since he was a child in Lebanon. It has now followed him to Australia and is still happening. What does that tell you? I mean, when you have 100% verified physical evidence that something strange happened, how can you say that this is bogus, this is bullshit? How can you say that this is pseudoscience? How can you make those claims when you have physical proof that Peter encountered some extremely, extremely bizarre individuals under circumstances that cannot be explained. I challenge you to debunk that one. I mean, just real science was levied upon this case, and they're still probably to this day scratching their heads. Who the hell were these people? How did they get there? How did they appear and disappear? Where the hell did they come from? How did they, show these signs of these DNA profiles? How did the shaft of their hair and their root of their hairs have different DNA profiles? How are they immune to diseases and viruses? It just goes on and on. This is the thing that people are out there experiencing every day. And it doesn't, for the most part, see the light of day because science turns its back on it. But sometimes, like in this case, when science turns its eye and credible witnesses and credible investigators work together, they come up with incredible evidence. And this is one of those cases. I implore you all to tune into Erica Luke's channel, UFO Classified on YouTube, and you can look up the Peter Khoury, Bill Chalker interview. I implore you to check that out. I wrote an article on this case too because I'm so enthralled with this, and you can find that article posted on normalparanormal.org. My friend Justin is an amazing author and researcher who agreed to put the article up on his website. So you can find my article there. You can find Erica's interview with him on YouTube at UFO Classified. And I implore you to look into this case. Get Bill's book. It's phenomenal. Hair of the Alien, DNA and Other Forensic Evidence of Alien Abduction. It's fantastic. He talks about not only Peter's case, but some other cases there that are equally mind-blowing. So I encourage you to do that. Above all, stay weird, keep searching, and don't let anyone discourage you. If you get called a weirdo, chances are you're probably on the right path, and just keep doing it. Keep searching, because the truth is out there. But it takes some work to find it. Thanks for joining me, everyone. We'll see you next time in the bunker.